Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and today I'll be covering chapter 6 of my book, Iesus, Deus, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean God. As I'd like to remind people, this is just a teaser for those of you interested in buying the book. For those of you who have the book, you can use this as your guiding light through the main thesis. As you go through the weeds of the footnotes and everything else, this can be your guiding light. So, without further ado, let's dive in. I entitled Chapter 6, The Name Above Every Name, Jesus in Greco-Roman Theonomy. And I hate jargon, but I do use this term theonomy with a Y, which indicates the bestowal of a divine name. So sometimes you'll see theonomy with a double O, which refers to divine law, but when you see the Y there, the double Y, this refers to a divine name, from onomos in Greek and theos. The name above every name obviously comes from Philippians 2, which I'll be reading in a second. And this is an exciting chapter because it's a very in-depth exegesis of the cultural background behind the bestowal of a divine name on Jesus, and what was the cultural background and what were the cultural presuppositions behind this that illumine the text and give it meaning. Without those assumptions in place, we're unable to understand the text. So one has to do the hard work of reconstruction to get back to what the original poet or prose writer meant by this phrase. I'll just remind everybody of the thesis of the book, namely that early Christians deified Jesus in their literature for the same reason that other ancient Mediterranean peoples deified their heroes, rulers, and benefactors. Jesus was, in this sense, hardly unique, and it's important to recognize that and to recognize the logic of what I consider to be the discursive or literary deification of Jesus, that is, the full-on description of Jesus as a divine being. And in chapter 1, we begin with Jesus's very first experience of human life, which is his conception and birth. As for the chapter thesis, I argue that the reception of a divine name, theonomy, in both cult and literature of the ancient world was a way to deify the recipients of that name. With that name came power and status. Not necessarily essence, but certainly power and status. Gods are benefactors, and they share their benefits. They share their power and they share their status. And this is what is communicated or signaled by their bestowal of their own divine name. So again, the main text that I'm looking at is Philippians 2, 9 through 11. Now back in 2014, when I published this study, these verses were somewhat neglected when you compared them to the verses of the initial lines of this passage, that is verses 6 through 8. Most would consider this some kind of prose hymn, some kind of poetic prose, poetic style prose. And it's not exactly safe to say that, Christians sung this in Philippi, but it is nonetheless something fairly early and what people have thought of as a Jewish way, a native Jewish way or Judean way of deifying Jesus by the bestowal of the name. In later Valentinian literature, we see the same kind of thing where the name of the Father is the Son, to quote the Gospel of Truth, and that one ancient way of expressing the Son's divinity or equality with the Father is to speak of his reception of the Father's name. But let me read this passage, or rather excerpt it, because we can't fit everything on the screen. Quote, God super exalted him, that is Jesus, and bestowed on him the name above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee might bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Kyrios, or Lord, unquote. And Kyrios, as most interpreters will point out, is the substitution for Yahweh in the Septuagint. It also has a basic meaning of sir or lord, as in master of a slave. So, I mean, in effect, it's not explicitly stated what the name above every name is, but it seems to have something to do with Kyrios. And if it's meant in that fulsome sense as a representation of the divine name Yahweh, then the name that Jesus receives is in fact Yahweh. And I think that this reading is basically convincing, and it makes sense in light of ancient practice of kings and rulers getting the name of the high God imprinted on themselves, often when they were coronated. So let me first begin way back, even earlier than Greco-Roman antiquity, and as far back as ancient Egypt. Since the 4th dynasty, ancient Egyptian pharaohs typically received 5 distinct names in their coronation. 2 of these names named after Horus, and these 5 names were all indicative of the divine character and rule of the king. The pharaoh, to be more precise, was considered to be Horus himself, an incarnation of Horus, called Horus in the palace. And when the pharaoh, who was recognized as a man, occupied the office of pharaoh and took on the double crown of Egypt, in a sense, he became divine and the divine representative of the names that he wore, as it were, or carried with him. And several of these names had to do with Horus, Amun, Amun-Re, the high deity, and these were quite lofty names. And when Greek and later Roman rulers took over Egypt and became the pharaohs, this tradition continued without skipping a beat. So both Greek and Roman rulers received a set of 5 names when they were officially inducted as kings of Egypt. And many of these names survive in cartouches in Egypt on the sacred temples and buildings. Now, ancient Israel never had a robust tradition of theonomy, that is, kings receiving divine names. There are cases where, however, a king is said to receive a divine name, and that is chiefly in Genesis, when Joseph, in his capacity as vice regent to the Pharaoh, seems to receive a name, a divine name, which would be normal for Egypt. Daniel, in the book of Daniel, receives the name of a Babylonian deity and changes his name. But those don't seem to be native Israelite traditions. The only case of a native Israelite king in a native Israelite tradition receiving a divine name, or rather 2 divine names, is in Isaiah 9:6 in English versions, where we find that the prophesied king receives the name warrior god, or sometimes it's El Gabor, it's God the hero, and eternal father, and or father of eternity. And these names, we don't know how standard they were. We don't know if many Israelite kings received them, but in this very specific case, at least it seems one Israelite king received them or was prophesied to receive them. And later, of course, Christians took this as a messianic prophecy. But I think originally it wasn't. It was just an Israelite practice of theonomy. The only other relevant Israelite practice of theonomy, which I don't talk about in the book, but definitely deserves mention, is the high priest bearing the name of Yahweh on a gold plate. And I can recommend the works of Crispin Fletcher Louis on this theme. I think also Margaret Barker has a lot to say about this. But this is also an important tradition, and later, as we get into Hellenistic times and the Maccabean high priests, the king and the priest was filled by the same man. And so, in a sense, when the priest bears the name of Yahweh and goes into the inner sanctum of the Holy of Holies, this is also a royal tradition by the time of Judas Maccabeus and Simon and John Hyrcanus. So this was something that they evidently thought of and practiced in interaction with Egyptian and Greco-Roman traditions, and it's Greco-Roman traditions that I'm going to tackle next. We can start the journey with Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, who was honored as Zeus Philippios. And it's disputed what this phrase actually meant. Is this the Zeus that belongs to Philip, or Philip's particular Zeus? Or is Zeus sharing his name with Philip? Literally, this is the Philippic Zeus, the Zeus with the character and quality of Philip. So it's not exactly clear what the phrase meant, but based on later attestation, you also, with the Hellenistic rulers, the heirs of Alexander the Great, Alexander, although widely thought to be divine and proclaiming his own divinity, never took on a specific divine name, but his heirs did, namely Seleucus I, Zeus Nicator, there was Antiochus Epiphanes, there was Julius Caesar, Epiphanes being a name meaning manifest, but also connoting manifest deity. And the disputed tradition that Julius Caesar received, or was at least offered, the name Jupiter Julius. We don't need to solve, the inner, the debate about whether he was or did or did not take on that divine name. His heirs certainly did. Augustus, Claudius, Nero, all of these receive altars and acclamations as Zeus, or Jupiter, as it were. And it's often when they are performing activities in accordance with their role as supreme ruler and representative of the high god, the one manifesting the power of the high god, that they receive these titles from mostly Greek communities in the East. And this is important because, this isn't mere adulation. This does occur when, a particular city receives a divine benefit and is wildly happy and wants to honor the ruler. But I don't think I don't think there's any deceit involved here. I mean, the ancient Hellenic peoples really did live closer to their gods, I think, and they really did see divine power surging through their rulers. So it wasn't kind of like a mere, it can't be dismissed as mere exaggerated praise. And certainly we see this in iconography as well, where people like Claudius is in the picture here, is depicted exactly as Zeus is. And we can debate about what that means or meant to the artists and to those who saw this kind of iconography and used this kind of language. But I think that it can't all be dismissed as mere playfulness and adulation. let me just say a bit more about the context and meaning of the reception of the divine name. All of those rulers who received a divine name were in fact worshipped as deities, as gods in the cult. They received temples, they received sacrifices, they received offerings, they were prayed to, they were made the subject of vows. So this is, when you give a ruler a divine name, it doesn't come by itself. You're also expressing other deifying honors. And this is just one example of a deifying honor that you're using among many. The second point is that these rulers who receive divine names, it's not assumed that they are the high deity come in the flesh, or that, the high deity completely overlaps in identity with the earthly ruler. But it is widely conceived that the earthly ruler is fulfilling a function. By bearing the divine name, the ruler represents the deity, the vice, and appears as vice regent of the deity. So, if in Egypt we can maybe make the case that, Pharaoh is an incarnation of Horus, it's not widely thought at all that Augustus was an incarnation of Zeus. He was a manifestation of Zeus, but that's something different. And what Augustus or Nero or Claudius is a vice regent. That is someone ruling for Zeus on the payroll, part of the middle management of Zeus's team, representing Zeus as a kind of ambassador. And, so Zeus or any other deity bestows upon that ruler honor or power and an aura of majesty. It's not a strict identification of human ruler and God. At least this is how I'm reading theonomy. Others may have other interpretations, of course, whether more radical or less. But let me just wrap up the contents of the chapter, and those with comments can absolutely feel free to leave them and let me know what you think. But basically, I think it can be concluded that theonomy was a fairly standard cultic practice and encomiastic practice, by which I mean a practice that people would use to praise and honor a deity. And theonomy doesn't include full identification with the deity. It's rather the expression or endowment of that deity's power being shared with the human ruler. It was a status symbol, certainly. But I think, one has to take a middle ground here. You can't say it's merely an upgrade in status. For the ancients, status had something to do with ontology. So if you were a higher status, you were actually physically better. And, this is a little bit foreign to modern mentalities, and perhaps rightly so, but that is how they tended to think in the ancient world. So, masters were actually physically and morally better than slaves, and that's a fairly wide conception in the ancient world. We're long before the era of human rights and human equality. So this is what I concluded, basically, and tying it back to Jesus in Philippians 2 shows us that in whatever way the Christians, spoke those verses, whether it was before Paul or Paul spoke in this kind of poetic ways, that Jesus received a name higher than any other name. Obviously, it's one-upmanship, saying that Jesus is a better God than any other, or a better human who became a God, and a better human who, because he got better status and more power, basically. But as you can see, the Christians are playing a game of one-upmanship within a culture that already tells them what it would mean to receive a divine name. In the modern world, rulers don't receive divine names, at least as far as I'm aware. So this practice has frittered away, and we're no longer able to really understand what's going on when a person receives a divine name. But in the ancient world, you would definitely receive that as a sign and signal of deification and of vice regency. Jesus becomes Kyrios, that is, master of the universe, by donation from the high God. And the high God, called Father, receives honor and glory through that, because he rules through his vice regent. And that is my take. In closing, I'll just say thank you to everybody who was able to join today. These short lessons, I hope, are helpful for you plowing through the book. For those of you who don't have it, I hope that you will consider purchasing it and dive into all those footnotes and, get used to looking deeper, I should say, and forming your own opinions on these texts and making your own interpretations. Ultimately, that's what I hope that I'm empowering you to do. Till we meet next time, thank you again and take care.